We are the Guinea Pig Collective. All will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.
How you can imagine.
Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome back to another Toys from the Past. So on today's Toys from the Past, we are going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons and its affiliated franchises, and one in particular, Heroes Quest. Now, before I could talk about the Heroes Quest game, I'm going to have to give it a little bit of background on how the D&D franchise got started and how all these other franchises wound up piggybacking off that success. So the original D&D formula and format, as was originally put out, was done in 1974. And it consisted of a role-playing guidebook along with miniatures and a roll-up hexagon map that you would actually draw on to create a playable map surface in order to progress in your game. Now, eventually they wound up doing away with this and it became a purely verbal role-playing game as opposed to having to use the miniatures. And following the success of that, TSR released a small board game in 1980 designated as Dungeon. This was a very simple take on the Dungeons and Dragons premise with a dungeon crawl type of board game where you had little plastic pawns. There was nothing fancy about this. There was no miniatures and you had cards. This was basically a card type board game. There were dice element in it, obviously, for moving and attacking, and the treasures and the monsters and everything else were all done on these little cards. It was a pretty simple premise, and it was actually a pretty fun game. I used to have this game. Not sure if it's still around or not. Could be over my father's house like everything else, or it might have been stolen. I just have no clue at this point. And on the heels of that, in 1979, Citadel Miniatures came into existence. Eventually, they would become Games Workshop, who produces the Warhammer title of games. Now, the very first Warhammer that was created by them wound up coming in 1983 with the miniatures based on the original gameplay from those early Dungeons and Dragons type of formats. There were miniatures and board designs that you would actually play as opposed to just being a role-playing game, which by this point Dungeons and Dragons had already moved into. Now, that's not to say that there weren't still miniatures out there, and some people played Dungeons & Dragons the old way that it was originally made, but most people were already moving off to just a role-playing, talking, verbal type of game, which is what you see now for the most part when people talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Then, in 1989, Milton Bradley created this game right here, Heroes Quest. Now, as you can see, the one I have here is not in the greatest shape in the world. I have had this since 1989, and it has taken a lot of abuse and a lot of moves and everything else, so it's a little beat up. But as you can see in the front of it, it has like a basic setup on the assembly and how the game is going to wind up being played. And of course, you had the big giant board that everything took place on, like most of the older board games did back then. And then as you look in there, obviously you see that there is the Hero Quest book. Now, the quest book was really cool because it not only showed you how you were going to set up the board, but it gave a small story and it told you all the traps or anything else that was in each room. And then, of course, there was the player book for the character of Zargon, who was the dungeon master. Now, a lot of the other things I have here were stuff that I just wound up photocopying for the use of the players. And then this way they could make their purchases and stuff like that, because there was actually upgrades that you can get in the game. Now, the big card stop backing there is for Zargon, that he would basically corner off his end of the map so the players couldn't see what he had and what he was doing behind the board, and it gave him a list of all the monsters and their attack points and everything else. And that top that I'd taken off, that was actually some of the weapons, which I'm going to be showing again in a minute. And along with all that, of course, you had all the cards, and then you had the small characters. Now, the different thing about between the old TSR dungeon and this one is each character actually had some kind of stats and everything else, and it actually came with small little figures that were, they weren't like super detailed, but they were fairly detailed for little plastic miniatures, such as the Barbarian, which the Barbarian, of course, being like the typical Conan type figure, just had a sword. Then you also had the Wizard, and the Wizard very Tolkien-ish and everything else, where he had a staff, the typical fantasy type wizard. Then you had a Dwarf, of course, standard dwarf, once again being the little short guy bearing an axe. And of course, having the typical long beards that they always seem to attribute dwarfs with. And the next one, the elf. And of course, being like the typical elf, a bit of a more of a slender figure with pointy ears, and he carried a sword. And of course, you had the monsters. The first one up is the Goblin. Now, the Goblin actually came in two different types for this board game. He came with a short dagger or a short sword for him, and he also came with a small hatchet. The next figure up would be the Skeleton. And the Skeleton just came in plain white, and he came with a scythe. And the next one up would be the Zombie. And the Zombie, once again, was standard in white, and he came with a big giant meat cleaver. The next figure on the list would be the Orc. Now, the Orc actually came in a few different styles. One came with a flail, one came with an oversized axe, and the last one came with a big sword. The next creature up on the list is another fantasy creature, being the Fenrir. I'm not really sure what the Fenrir was supposed to be, but he only came with a big giant double-bladed axe. And the next one up would be the Mummy. Now, these are actually all listed in stat-wise as being the most powerful, from the least powerful to the most powerful. So the next one up was the Chaos Warrior. The Chaos Warrior only coming in gray and only coming with an axe. And these figures actually, as you get down to the bottom, are start to become limited in number, such as the Gargoyle. The Gargoyle was the only single one like him in the box, and he had actually taken on the role of a boss in many of the stories that came in the booklet. And speaking of the booklet is what actually drives that story. I showed that briefly early on. Without that, you really don't know what's going on, and it adds a lot of depth to it. And this one was actually not really listed much, and it was the Chaos Sorcerer. And once again, he was the only single one like him. But the booklet itself, it actually told the story of who each character was, and it gave you a backdrop to it too. So it wasn't just a role-playing game so much as it was a really immersive fantasy game. Now, when you take the board and you start setting up the 3D objects such as the bookshelf and the weapons rack, you start to get a little bit more of an actual feeling of a room when you wind up placing your character inside of it. Now, of course, because of all the other things in the room, your character is limited in the number of spaces he can actually move when he's in a room, and especially if there winds up being a ton of monsters in there with him. This is actually just an element that I found that was really cool because it gave it a little bit of immersive feeling to the game. And some of the pieces you could see actually had some pretty decent detail, considering that they were plastic and hard cardboard. And the cardboard was actually not cheap as opposed to some of the cardboard that you see in today's games. This stuff has actually lasted very well after all these years. most of the pieces that I have are still in pretty damn good shape, and they actually included tiles such as a trap tile, which was representative of a little skull, and then there was one for falling rocks where the pathway collapsed on the heroes. There was just a lot of elements to this game that made it very unique and very special to me. And of course, the number one thing in the game is the die, because that is how everything is played out in this game and resolved. The first one I'm going to show is the black shield or black skull. Now this one is actually the defense die of the monsters. The next one is the plain skull, which is the attack. And the last one is a shield, and the shield represents the hero's defense when they are rolling. And it's like the old Risk game where you would roll, and depending on what your roll was, that would be your attack or your defense. You would have to match or beat it in order to get ahead in the game as far as a combat situation. Now, some of the things that I'm trying to show on this armory thing are actually extra weapons and equipment that you would get, and it would increase the stats of your hero by either adding more health points or more attack die or defense die to your character. And you would have these little sheets, and you would write down everything pertinent to the information of your character, you know, the name, the spells that they would use, whatever gold they had, whatever extra weapons they had. And then you would write down the number of hit points and attack points that they would have. So you would always remember, because this is a continuing game. You're never going to be able to play all of them at once. So you would write down what you have, and then you would pick up your character sheet and your character, and you would continue on the next time you got together to be able to play this game. Now, some of the things that came with it, of course, were artifact cards, which, you know, they would increase your defense die or your health points. And then, of course, there were chaos spells that were only for the monsters and for the dungeon master, who was known as Zargon. Now, all these different spells did different things, and many of them could not be blocked. And of course, there was loot cards that you could get, and then there were the spell cards for the hero themselves. There were 3 classes of spells. There was fire, there was water, and there was earth. Now, the wizard, being the most powerful and most adept at spells, would wind up getting 2 groups of spells. Now, he could not pick and choose which spells. He would have to pick 2 full categories of spells. So he would have to either pick all fire and all water, or all water and all earth, and so on and so on. The last set of spells would wind up going to the elf, who had some magical abilities. I spent countless hours playing this game, and it was such a good and it's such a fun game to play. I mean, I really can't say enough about it, and the fact that I still have it all these years and in still decent condition, yeah, you know what, it's a lot to be said about the manufacturing skill of a fairly simple game from all the way back then. I don't even know what these things cost today on the market, but the last time that I looked, a decent set would run a minimum of $75 for this game, and I want to say that this entire game maybe cost $25 brand new when it first came out in 1989. Anyway, guys, that's all I have to say on this one. Do you remember this game? Have you ever seen this game? Are you interested in this game? Did you possibly have this one? Do you still have it? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And of course, my friends, as always, I am so happy that you came here and you spend time on the channel with me, and we could reminisce just a little bit. Even if you don't know this one, maybe you found it interesting, and I showed you something different that you have never seen before. And if you enjoyed what you've seen and what you heard, go ahead and destroy that like button for me. And if you are new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. I hope that you've had a good time. And if you liked what you've seen and what you heard so far, I would hope that you would consider subscribing. I would appreciate it. And remember, guys, never let anybody tell you what you can and can't do, what you should or shouldn't say, because your silence gives consent. And I will catch you all next time. Later, y'all.